I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Last Monday, March 23rd, was crossover day in the Maryland General Assembly. If a bill introduced in one chamber has not been voted on and passed to the other chamber by midnight, they go to the Rules Committee, which generally means that the bill will not be considered this session. Only high priority bills supported by the leadership tend to fast track through the Rules Committee. Once bills cross over, the other chamber can pass, amend, or vote down a bill. If they amend, the first chamber gets it back, or they can have a joint session. On Thursday, March 26th, the House of Delegates passed next year's budget bill, which now goes to conference between the chambers. In 2 weeks, the 2026 session of the state legislature will end. I asked Delegate Marc Korman, who is the chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee in the House, for an update. Starting this year, his committee has also been responsible for energy bills. Before we go to Marc Korman, however, the Montgomery County Board of Education on Thursday, March 26th, approved the superintendent's plan to implement 6 new program regions, dissolving the Down County Consortium and the Northeast Consortium in an effort to increase access to magnet programs across the district. The move also changes countywide recruitment in MCPS's marquee magnet programs like the STEM programs at Blair and Poolsville High Schools, the IB program at Richard Montgomery High School, and the Visual Arts program at Einstein High School. There are fears that the size of the programs will shrink and the coursework offered in the programs will become less rigorous if they lose students and resources as a result. The school board also approved a plan to move Wooten High School from its Wooten Parkway location to the new building, which was meant to be Crown High School, which will now not open but instead house Wooten High School. Expect lots of stories of heartache and, I believe, lawsuits. I'll be back with Marc Korman with the state legislative update. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from the Baltimore woodwind wizard Seth Keibel. The songs come from his album No Words. Seth Keibel himself on clarinet, flute, and tenor saxophone, Sean Lane on piano, Scott Giambusso and Bob Abbott double bass, Sammy Arifin guitar, Mark Carson and Wes Crawford drums. The album was recorded and mixed by Blake Alphen. You can find Seth Keibel's music at sethkeibel.com. Marc Korman, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thanks, Sunil. Just no matter how many times you say it, I just can't hate politics. So good to be with you.
Crossover day is over. What is notable? What did we leave behind? What are we taking forward?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, crossover day means that bills have to have gotten from one chamber to the other to be sort of guaranteed a hearing in that other chamber, be guaranteed to go to the committee of jurisdiction and not the dreaded rules committee in the opposite chamber. So hundreds of bills have crossed over. Nothing is over until the presiding officers say we can go home. But I think, usually at this time you can tell what still has a pulse and what doesn't. So things that obviously still have a pulse, as with every year, is the state budget. That's still working its way through both chambers. As we record this, it'll go to conference later this week. That's the operating budget, along with something called the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which is a bill that creates legal changes to help to balance the budget. There's also the state capital budget, the construction budget. That's a little further behind in the process. It's over from the Senate, but hasn't gone to the House floor yet.
Editorial note. The House of Delegates passed next year's budget yesterday, March 26th, and it now goes to conference committee.
Energy has been a big issue this legislative session. Before crossover, the House sent a comprehensive energy bill over to the Senate. Again, as we record this, that bill is over in the Senate Committee of Jurisdiction. Housing has been a big issue, as you know and have tracked closely. Several bills that the governor is supporting have made it through both chambers. One around transit-oriented development, another around what they call housing certainty, which is largely early vesting, and a few other changes to make the process and procedure for developing new housing a little bit easier and more stable. A big bill from the governor's Department of Housing and Community Development, however, did not proceed, which is the Starter and Silver Homes Act, which has gotten a lot of press, but didn't make it through the process. All sorts of other bills. The governor had a bill on vaccinations that's making its way through the process. There's legislation related to our child care scholarships. That's a pretty big deal, making its way through the process. There's bills on pediatric overstays. Where do you put young people when there's sort of no place for them to go, which has been a problem for years. We've had young people, without supervision at hotels or stuck in hospitals. So that's been an ongoing effort that our speaker in particular has been very involved with.
Let's talk about the energy bill that went from your committee to the Senate. What are the highlights?
Yeah, so it's actually a very comprehensive bill. It deals with lots of immediate issues as well as medium and long-term issues, because we do have an electricity pricing affordability problem. And it's driven by a lot of factors. It's driven by, it's a regional and national problem. It's not just a Maryland problem. It is certainly driven by inflation. It is certainly driven by expected future demand from data centers and a whole host of other things. Now, some of those things are really just beyond the power of the Maryland General Assembly to control, obviously, but there are some things we can have some control over. So one in particular is what's called the Empower program, which is a surcharge on your bill. For the average ratepayer, it's $20 to $30 a month that goes to electricity conservation. And that's important. We want to do conservation. We want to be more efficient. If we're not doing any conservation, we're locking in high electric prices for generations, which doesn't make any sense. But it is a direct line item that we have a lot of control over on your bill as state lawmakers. And so what the bill that the House passed does is it reduces the goal for 3 years of how much conservation we want to have. It sets aside some money that we already have in a bank account called the Strategic Energy Investment Fund and puts that towards the program so that more of the conservation programs are paid for by that fund rather than on the surcharge on your bill. It eliminates gas and power entirely, which is something the environmental community is supportive of. It makes a few other tweaks, all with the idea that in the future, we're going to go back to increasing the goal in a few years once we've dealt with kind of the immediate challenges on pricing. And so that's something we can do kind of immediately to help support lower bills for ratepayers. Then there are a number of things in the bill to help with the medium and long term. For example, we know we want more generation in the state. We have, again, money in the Strategic Energy Investment Fund that we can use to push that forward. And so we've set aside $100 million a year for 2 years to do solar plus storage deployment in the state of Maryland. We know we need more generation to deal with the supply side. And so that's something that can help with that. We also want the utilities to spend their dollars more efficiently, not just spend more, but spend smarter. And so we have some provisions to require them to go through certain reviews if they're doing underground transmission. And also, whenever they're doing any kind of infrastructure upgrade, that they look at grid enhancing technologies, which is a potentially smarter, more efficient, cheaper way to get more out of the current grid rather than just building more and more.
I know the utilities in Maryland have wanted their own generation. Was there any consideration for that?
There was a bill, I believe, on the Senate side. Senator Kevin Harris from Prince George's and Charles had that bill. On the House side, Delegate Pam Queen from Montgomery County had that bill, and those bills have not been voted out of either chamber.
Any work on the interconnection problem with PJM that, have you found a way to address that in using state law?
Yeah, I mean, I think PJM has taken a lot of steps to reform their queue, as it's called. So the problem we were having, as you know, and I know you've covered on the show before, but just as a brief refresher for people, we had a lot of generation ready to plug in, but they need our regional grid operator, which is PJM's permission to do so. And that was a very slow process. And frankly, a lot of projects died on the vine during that process. And that's not entirely PJM's fault. That's also a result of federal changes that cost the financing of a number of projects. But I would say PJM has gotten a little bit better. They've done some improvements and some reforms with a lot of pushing from, state lawmakers around the region to try to do things differently. So for example, one thing they're doing is they're not letting things in the queue that aren't really ripe to be in the queue because they're just taking up space. And so they're doing a better job of making sure things going in the queue actually belong there and are at a ripe enough stage that PJM should be wasting its time and resources reviewing it to make sure it can be interconnected. I think there is definitely more work to be done in this regard. And I want to shout out Delegate Charkoudian and Senator Hester in particular, who have been huge leaders, not just in Maryland, but regionally in pushing on PJM to do a better job.
Data center regulation, anything on that?
Yeah, so data centers are a part of the energy package that I mentioned. There were a lot of bills on data centers from, actually people in both parties. Again, Delegate Charkoudian, Senator Hester, Delegate Marc Fisher from Calvert County, Delegate Sheila Ruth from Baltimore County. So lots of ideas on this. I would say it's still in a little bit of flux. I mean, I can tell you it was in the House bill, but I know the Senate, plans to give it its own kind of review and treatment. So I think we'll likely see at a minimum some expectations placed on data centers coming to Maryland, what we'd like to see in terms of community benefits agreements, backup power, use of renewable energy, as well as a registry to make sure we kind of know where these things are going, where they're going to be, not only for policymakers, the Public Service Commission, but also for community members to be able to go on and see a map online of where these things will be. But again, I know the Senate is looking at some other changes to that as well, and so that's a little bit of a to be continued as we continue to move through the legislative session here.
There is concern about data centers, obviously, and you mentioned this before. Data centers raising the electricity prices for the rest of us. There's a differential in the way that industrial use of electricity is charged and residential use. Is there any effort to sort of get that fixed?
I don't know if there's an effort to get that fixed, but I think what you're trying to see, quote unquote, fixed with the data centers is a real push on bring your own power. And I think you're seeing that both at a state level, a regional level, and really a national level. That's something that's actually, been coming out of the White House. Now, of course, when the White House says bring your own power, they want you to bring your own coal-fired power plant. When Delegate Charkoudian says we want you to bring your own power, we're thinking of something much cleaner. And of course, I tend to agree with her more than the White House. But I think the idea in general that we want data centers not just plugging into the grid and starting to use power as though they were just another business starting up makes a lot of sense. We want them to have sort of a plan in place about where their electricity is going to be from. So it's not necessarily about the rate differential. It's about them actually bringing their own maybe power purchase agreement to actually, power their operation.
The reason I was asking you is because the state has some control through the Public Service Commission on the rate, but PJM just rejected the idea of bring your own energy at their board meeting. So it's hard. Do you think you have any?
They didn't really reject it. I mean, it's PJM's governance is complicated. Yes, they had a meeting where they rejected a bunch of different proposals, but they are working on their own bring your own power proposal in response to something that came out of the White House and demands from many of the states. So I know how that was reported, but that's not entirely. It's not as though PJM has said, nope, that's it. We're not doing bring your own power. That
is true, but they had voted down the possibility of all the possible options that were presented to the board, not to the board, to the general body, that they had turned them down. So you think that there is still space for the state to act in that area? And so just clarify if you can.
I think there's room for PJM to act in that area, and I think they will be acting. Now, I think the states will have to do something, and it's not just us, obviously. All the states will have to do something in sort of concert with that and in response to that. And again, shout out to Senator Hester and Delegate Charkoudian, who have been very involved in tracking what PJM is doing to make sure that the state is acting accordingly.
Is there anything else in the energy bill that is notable?
I will shout out Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, who's the chair of the subcommittee on the House side, for his leadership on a whole host of issues. But one thing in particular he did that I think is important and is going to have a lot of future value is a few years ago we established something called the Drive Act. It's a great bill to try to have more behind the meter storage at your house and do things like time of use tariffs where your sort of deal with your utility is that they can tap into your behind the meter battery at certain times if it would be useful for the overall grid. It's a great program. But one thing Delegate Fraser Hidalgo realized is that part of it was going to end up being rate based and show up on people's bills. And we don't want to put more things on people's bills right now. So he helped in the energy package reform that program so that we could keep it out of people's bills directly, but still have the policy in place. And again, using that Strategic Energy Investment Fund account, invest in the storage devices that way rather than putting it on people's bills.
How do you keep something off rate base like that?
In this case, it was a specifically language in the legislation that was going to allow it to show up in people's bills. And so you can make changes to the law that explicitly don't allow that. But of course, if you want it to still happen, you have to find other ways to pay for it. And that's what Delegate Fraser Hidalgo did. He worked to use our Strategic Energy Investment Fund to get the incentive money needed for the storage devices, because that's where a lot of the cost was, is buying the storage devices or giving rebates to people to buy the storage devices. So the program will still be able to continue, maybe not the scale that was anticipated, but we also won't have the scale of impact to ratepayers that was expected as well.
Any environmental bills that your committee passed?
There are a lot of environmental bills. I'll shout out one in particular because my state senator was involved, Sarah Love, as well as Delegate Dana Stein from Baltimore County. And this was a bill on the application of wastewater sludge to agricultural land. This has been an issue for quite a while. Wastewater sludge has PFAS and PFOS in it, families of forever chemicals, which can obviously be quite problematic. There's not a lot of good things to do with the wastewater sludge at this point. There's not room in landfills for it. You don't want to burn it. It's very hard to sort of treat and clean. So one thing that it's used for is to help grow food on farms. This legislation, which has passed both chambers, would set some standards around that to make sure that what we're applying is at the sort of lowest level of problem possible, and that we're not creating future problems by applying sludge with PFAS, onto our farmland.
All right, let's do some budget work. What are the changes you're expecting to the budget document from the Senate? Are there some major things that the House is taking a look at that might change things?
Yeah, I actually don't think there are major differences. There are always some differences. The budget document, as you know, Sunil, is extremely long, and there's a lot of very specific points to it. Sometimes we're dealing with a proposed $250,000 cut that the Department of Legislative Services recommends, that one chamber agrees to and the other chamber disagrees with. So you end up with a laundry list of things at conference that you have to kind of resolve. I spent 9 years, as you know, on the Appropriations Committee, so had a lot of fun experiences doing that. There are some years where there is a big gulf between the House and the Senate. This is just not one of those years. I think on many of the major issues, there is agreement, and there's been a lot of upfront work to get to that agreement. The Speaker of the House, Speaker Peña-Melnyk, had a big focus on having the House and Senate budget leaders spend a lot of time together earlier to avoid some of that brinksmanship that sometimes occurs towards the end of session. And I think that's paid off well this year, where a lot of really difficult choices have sort of already been worked out. There was concerns about behavioral health cuts. There's issues with developmental disabilities administration. There's always the question about how much you're going to leave in fund balance, in case things are out of whack a little bit, how much to put in the rainy day fund, things like that. Most of those big issues, I think there's pretty common alignment between the House and the Senate on. I think what you're going to see is sort of a laundry list of smaller differences that will hopefully be worked out relatively quickly in a conference committee.
The projected deficit was $1.4 billion. That's a lot of money. Where did that money come from? I believe there's $450 million from the rainy day fund, and the local income tax reserve fund is giving us $380 million. So what are the big items that is making up that $1.4 billion?
Yeah, so keep in mind when you say the projected deficit, that's right, it was a projected deficit. And then, of course, the governor has to submit to us in January a balanced budget. And then we have to leave here with a balanced budget, though we can make changes to what that looks like. So we never actually have an operating deficit. right? We balance our budget every year. If it goes out of balance in the middle of the year, there's a lot of tools to deal with that. But then we do show in the future often projected shortfalls. And frankly, except for some, COVID sugar years, all the years I've been in the legislature, we've shown future year deficits, under governors of two parties, of both parties, but been able to balance that every year. There's a few other major sources this year. First of all, there's just kind of a group of cuts to the budget, the most significant of which is the Developmental Disabilities Administration. But really, the scale of the cuts, of individual cuts other than DDA, is not that big, but taken all together, they add up to, hundreds of millions of dollars. There's also some decoupling happening. So, as you know, in the federal reconciliation bill, there were a number of tax changes. The state is generally tied to the federal government. So if the federal government treats something as a business tax deduction, so do we. We can also decouple from them and treat things differently. And so we've done some additional decoupling, specifically from some of the business tax deductions, so that yes, the business will still get those federal tax benefits that the Congress decided to give them, but they won't get that same benefit at the state level. And then another big fund exchange, which is a challenging one, but one we had to do to balance the budget, is a shift of a few $100 million from that Strategic Energy Investment Fund I mentioned earlier. That's not what that fund is for, right? That fund is not for budget balancing. It is for investing in our energy future. But when you're in a difficult year, and you need to make difficult choices, the choice was made to take some of that money and put it towards our necessary budget balancing. That's not something I want to see every year, but it is something that had to happen in this year with a lot of other difficult choices.
Did I read it correct that the Board of Revenue March numbers show a $250 million more in tax collection than expected?
Yes, but I would say mostly it was a treading water situation. There was, however, a big uptick in estate taxes, and that is a very volatile source because thankfully we don't know exactly when everybody is going to die based on their bank account. So it is quite volatile. And there was a very big estate tax increase that has happened during this budget year, which is very helpful, obviously, but not something you can bank on, happening every year.
Or want.
Right.
On the spending side, the Senate added some cuts that the governor proposed back in, and the House is also trying to add some more money back. What are the big items?
The biggest restoration that occurred was to part of the Developmental Disabilities Administration. And this is an extremely, extremely challenging situation. That program has more than doubled over the past few years, and I view that as a good thing. That means we are providing more services to some of our most at-risk populations, and we should continue to make as much investment as we possibly can. But there is a sort of looming factor here, which is something called cost neutrality. We are subject to a Medicaid waiver where if we basically, in their eyes, overspend, quote unquote, overspend, that could risk our federal match at much higher dollar levels. So, of course, we want to do everything we can for this community, but we also need to be aware of this cost neutrality requirement. And so, again, the biggest restoration that happened was, I believe, $20-something million in restorations to the Developmental Disabilities Administration, but they still do face a cut here. And we call it DDA, but really it's DDA recipients and families that are going to feel the brunt of this. It's extremely challenging, but we also have to remember this cost neutrality issue, that if we run afoul of this, the cuts are going to be much, much worse. Another big restoration is childcare subsidies, along with some structural changes to that program to help it extend to more families that are more needy. So we're adding some copays for higher end earners. And when I say higher end, none of these people are higher end in the sense that they're, living on a yacht somewhere. But people who are on the higher end of the program, we're asking for a little bit of a copay, which will allow us to help even more people on the lower end of the economic scale of the program. And so by doing those structural changes, along with providing some dollars that we had available, we're able to have more childcare scholarships, which of course is really important. As you know, childcare costs are one of the biggest challenges for working families.
I saw also that there were $360 million more for public schools. Is that different from what the governor has proposed, or he had already proposed that, and that's what's moving forward?
So I'm not sure about that specific number. I do know that there was some restoration to some behavioral health tied to public schools. So I know that was one of the sort of restorations. I'm not sure about that specific number you're describing. And of course, even in a year with budget challenges, the public school budget usually rises, right? And that's by design. Our programs are designed to grow and scale up. Now, of course, the blueprint for Maryland's future, which you've covered, increased that even more, but that was true even before the blueprint. We have the foundation amount, which is the sort of dollar amount per student. That mostly grows every year absent some intervention by the governor or the legislature to stop that. And so you're always going to see, if possible, some growth in the public schools budget. But I know there was some particular restorations that took place in the sort of broader context of budget negotiations.
Okay. And state salaries are also, they're going to go up. I saw the number 144 million or something.
Yes, but if you think about the number of state employees, that's a relatively modest increase. And so state employees are right there at the table sacrificing along with many other parties to make this budget balanced and workable. So yes, there's a modest increase for state employees, but it's definitely not what they were looking for and not what many of us would like to do for them. These are very hardworking people who, in our region in particular, although the federal government may not be as stable as an employer as it used to be, the federal government paid more and often had better benefits, yet these people were often still choosing to be at state government. And so I think they deserve our respect and to be well compensated. They are getting an increase, but it's not at the level they were hoping.
One of the issues that has been around for a number of years is the vacancies in state government, which was affecting the work of agencies. Has that problem been mitigated at least now in the last several years, do you think?
So if you look at the agency by agency breakdown, some agencies have been very successful in bringing down their vacancy rates. Others haven't.
What is the difference?
I think there's a lot of factors. One, I think, there are just some agencies that have probably done a better job of getting out there and recruiting and offering up, good positions and a good story about why you'd want to work there. I think some agencies have very skills that are transferable, right? So if you worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation, you probably have skills that are transferable to the Maryland Department of Transportation. But if we're looking for a forensic psychiatrist, there's just not a lot of those out there, right? That's a very hard to fill position. And so I think there are some things that the agencies are able to make an attractive package and attract a lot of potential employees. They have transferable skills. There are other jobs where, again, doing a mental health position in a state prison is probably not a position that speaks to a lot of people. There are thankfully some people who are very committed to their work who are willing to go do that, but that is a harder position to fill than, say, a traffic planner at the Maryland Department of Transportation. So I think there's a lot of difference depending on where you're working in state government. So overall, the rate of vacancies is pretty high, but again, if you look at the individual agencies, some had good success bringing it down, and others have had less so.
Well, so that brings us to transportation. What is happening with the transportation fund gap?
This is actually a relatively stable year, and that, as you know, the last 2 years, there were some significant shortfalls that we're going to make doing some projects that people had already been promised, some programs people had already been promised, hard to do without revenue. And so for 2 years, we made some difficult revenue decisions. I don't think anyone's happy about higher registration fees or higher vehicle emission charges or anything like that. But that's what we have to do if we want to have roads that are well maintained, transit systems that are running, bridges that are being regularly inspected, local aid for roads and transit to our jurisdictions. And so we made those difficult choices over the last 2 years. And so this year is more of a stable year. Now, I would say there's a lot of needs out there that are not budgeted, right? So we can't say there's a budget shortfall because they're not budgeted, but there are a lot of needs out there that we know people are interested in. So if you live in the Baltimore region, you're probably very interested in the the Be More bus program, which is their sort of bus redesign and reinvestment. If you live on the Eastern Shore, you might be very interested in a new Bay Bridge. Right? If you live where you and I do, you might be interested in a new American Legion bridge, or more money for the metro system, or more money for the Marc rail. A lot of those things are unbudgeted. And so if we want to do this next generation of projects, we are probably going to have to think about how we're going to do that in the future. But for this year and this year's budget, it's a pretty stable condition for transportation.
Can we talk a little bit about health? There is a new committee now. What big bills were passed?
I do want to shout out Heather Bagnall, who's the chair of our new health committee. She had been a long-serving member of the Health and Government Operations Committee, which is, the new speaker kind of separated into pieces. And I think that healthcare committee has been quite busy. The vaccine stuff has taken up a lot of attention on the House floor. And of course, they did really important work last year being prepared for the expiration of the Obamacare tax benefits that had been added on during COVID that were supposed to be extended at the federal level, but they could never get a deal. And so those have dropped off, making Obamacare much more expensive. They last year passed a bill to basically hold at least some of our lower income folks harmless, I believe, for 2 years under that program, which was really important for healthcare affordability. And as you know, over the years, they've worked a lot on the pharmacy pricing board, which is another thing very well targeted at healthcare affordability.
The thing that I'm most concerned about, actually, apart from all this is the Health Services Cost Review Commission and the way they maintain the all-payer system, which balances out insurance costs in the state. That's about to end. So, did the committee? Do you know if they addressed that issue at all?
Yeah, I don't think they made major changes there. And I know you had Vice Chair Cullison on before session talking about this in a lot more detail than I ever could. I don't think they've made any sort of legislative changes on that. I think it is an ongoing kind of oversight issue with them and work they're doing with the Maryland Health Department and the Health Secretary, because they're sort of in the day-to-day negotiations with, I guess, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services on how the waiver is going to continue to work in the state of Maryland and what that transition is going to look like.
Marc Korman, thank you. And enjoy the next 3 weeks.
Thanks for having me on.
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from the Baltimore woodwind wizard, Seth Keibel. The songs come from his album, No Words. Seth Keibel on clarinet, flute, and tenor saxophone. Sean Lane on piano. Scott Giambuso and Bob Abbott on double bass, Sammy Arifin guitar, Mark Carson and Wes Crawford drums. The album was recorded and mixed by Blake Alfin. You can find Seth Keibel's music at sethkeibel.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email producer@ihbpod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.